Good afternoon. My name is Aysha, and thank you so much for joining us today for the online Minerals to Metals Forum hosted by the Southern African Institute for Mining and Metallurgy. Before we get started in the topic, I would like to simply go through some Zoom etiquette. During the discussion, please type your question in the Q&A section in the toolbox at the bottom of your screen. After the presentations, we will have a Q&A session to answer these questions. You may raise your hand at that time and speak directly to the panelists if you wish. Please note that this forum is recorded and will be made available to the public. You can remain anonymous, changing your name and leaving your questions in the chat. If you have any issues, please do not hesitate to send me a message. And if you would like to be added to the mailing list, please send me a private message with your email. So the following forum, which I'm very excited about, examines whether the concept of good environmental governance provides a useful tool and legal base for the achievement of water sustainability in South Africa's mining sector. We have with us today Dr. Bernard Kengni, who introduces water pollution as one key challenge to sustainability in South Africa, especially in the mining sector. The main question addressed today is how should the legal framework promote and guide water sustainability through good governance practices? The concept of governance is presented as a tool with which individuals or organizations can achieve effective water sustainability through decision-making, planning, and law enforcement. I would like to now hand over to Bernard to take us through his presentation. Thank you so much, Bernard, for joining us today. I think you're muted, Bernard.
I was really talking. So, well, I said thank you for giving me the opportunity once more. And it's always a pleasure to be able to share my thoughts and learn from your attendance. So yeah, it's always a learning session where you give and you take something back. Yeah, let me quickly share my screen. Can you see it, Aysha?
We can, but we're seeing the we're not seeing the present. There we go. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So the topic you're having in front of you is strengthening decision-making processes to promote water sustainability in the South African mining context. And what I look specifically is the role of good governance, good environmental governance, and the law. So this is born out of my PhD thesis, and this was the exact topic of my thesis. And the thesis itself was born out of my desire to, when I attended international trade, a course on international trade, or one of my models at master level was international trade, and the other one was environmental law. So looking at international trade, I started, I was very passionate about then. The more I learned about how some members of society pay the price for development, I started looking into the other side of international trade to look how if a lot of money is being made on the other side, what is happening on the other end. And my passion for environment and society drove me to this angle to say, okay, what impact is trade having on the environment and the people in and society as a whole? And so I started looking because I was in South Africa. So the one thing that came to me when I was doing my research or my background check before starting the research was I came across mining and started looking at it and learning how important mining is to the South African economy, and also seeing how mining affects a lot of communities in South Africa. Then it became something that I wanted to look into. And so I was looking at, from the start, I thought of environment as a whole, but after realizing with my supervisor that just environment was too broad, so I zoomed into water and And why water? Because water is, I also realized at that point that water was becoming an issue in South Africa, and South Africa being as an arid country. I thought, okay, let me focus on this. So the thesis itself, I structured it into 4 different parts. And of course, it's altogether, I think, 9 chapters divided into 4 parts, which whereby one part carries the introduction to the issue around um, mining and environment or water. And then I looked at the theoretical framework around the type of concepts I was going to work around. And then the legal framework that I had to look into. As a lawyer, I couldn't just dive into the topic without looking at the legal framework to see if it's even enough to solve the problem, or if it could, what needed to be fixed for it to achieve water sustainability in the South African mining context. And of course, the last part dealt with um, how these laws are implemented to achieve what the things I identified in my theoretical framework and so on. And of course, the conclusion. So looking at the introduction itself, what I mostly focus on the background and what the problem was. And like I hinted already earlier, I realized how good mining was to the economy, but also how vulnerable communities, which in my thesis I define as the communities that are badly affected or that are susceptible to be affected by mining. I mean, affected negatively, of course. So I start looking into that and realized that there was a big issue. So many communities across South Africa, especially in areas where, or particularly in areas where mining was taking place, were also being very affected by as a result of water pollution. And of course, some certain things I came across which are beyond the scope of my thesis, were even also whether even beside the environment, there were people whom they said they benefited nothing from mining and so on, but that's a whole story on its own. So I looked through that, and then as I did my my background work, I also come across that the law wasn't doing enough. The law wasn't doing enough. And then these are type of things that prompted me to look deeply into the legal framework and start looking and what are the type of things that can really uh, help to achieve water sustainability, or at least contribute. I know it's very challenging because of the nature of mining itself. It's always going to be challenging, but I do believe it can be improved. So I started from there. I realized that the problem, beside that water was being polluted, the legal framework that can do this can help to improve this problem or to contribute towards a solution was also not doing enough. And well, the question that I started asking myself was, what was the issue of, is it implementation, enforcement, and compliance? And because I was very more concerned about communities, I wanted to um, hold myself to one angle and looking at the South African constitutions and the different pieces of legislation. So I got to a point where I said to myself, before I think of what mining companies are not doing right, let me look at government first of all, because it is this government which owns the people of this country the duty to provide them with clean water and stuff. So I said, looking at the side of corporate governance or mining companies, responsibility in this, that could be a whole thesis on itself. So I decided to focus on government, those who are supposed to make the law, implement the law, and so on. So I was looking mostly at the state. What is it you are doing, and so on. And and then my research question, which already forms part of what Aysha highlighted earlier, about the main question was now, because I realized that um, whether the fact that the law wasn't achieving or wasn't getting water sustainability to where it's supposed to be was not because there were no laws. There were laws. And at the first look, the laws look also very fine on paper. So definitely one issue was how they were being implemented. And that's where I came up with this idea of governance and said, maybe it's not just a matter of saying the Department of Mineral Resources, for example, is issuing environmental authorizations or is telling mining companies what they must do, but how they are doing it. And then to look at how government actually go through its processes to see into it that laws are well implemented or enforced. I realized governance was something that would play a key role in that. So that's where this idea of governance and but adapted in the environmental context. So that's where I came up with the idea of environmental governance. So I was looking at how do we achieve water sustainability on one hand, then on the other hand, there is the law, but it seems like there need to be something else to even give this law implementation more impact. And I realized good governance could play that part. So that's where this idea of sustainability and governance came from. And considering how I was going to do this, from the outset, I wanted to do a case study where I will be able to speak to communities and speak to a mining company of my choice and the Department of Mineral Resources. And well, very far deep into my research, I think I was already in my third year when it was really time to go into that, into the case study. It became apparent that I couldn't get two of the participants. That would be the mining company and the government department that I choose. For some reason, they pulled out. I don't want to go into details, but they pulled out. They didn't want to carry on, and I realized how challenging it was to even get them to commit in the first place. So what I came up with was to focus on existing literature, but also look very deep into existing case studies. And that's why if you go through the thesis itself, there's a lot of references. And it also helped me a lot because I ended up because I had to look at different types of case studies and even scientific stuff and learning what pH was, which I knew nothing about before. And so I learned a whole lot of those things. And that's from the angle where how the research itself was carried out, mostly based on literature, desktop materials, and laws, legal analysis, and then case studies conducted by both people in the natural science, that's engineering, water science, and so environmental science, and then from the law side. And that's from how I built up the thesis. And so when the part on theoretical framework, the first thing I looked at was environmental sustainability or just sustainability to see what it meant in this context. And I came across this drawing or this sketch, which sort of sum up all my thoughts. So I borrowed it from somewhere. The name is on the drawing, twink.org. And so what I realized, which was possibly something I knew already, but I had to look deeper to get to understand what it means in the sustainability context, which it led me to understand that for sustainability to achieve, or what sustainability meant was, let's say in the context of mining, starting from my left, as we conduct mining activities, we have to consider the social pillar being the society, the people affected by mining or the people for whom mining is being conducted. Then to the right is the economic, because we all know different economies or countries, let me put it so, coming back to South Africa. South Africa depends a lot on its economy, and every now and then these days I hear of how COVID affected the economy and so on. So the economy has to be carried on, but that pillar must support the idea of sustainability. And then in the middle, the environment, where the people who created this, they did not explain it that way, but for me, I took it that way to say, if the environmental pillar is in the middle, to say it is the central pillar, we take care of society, we take care of our economy is going to exist on the right, our society is going to exist because they need this, but we need the environment in the middle to stand firm, because if that environment is not there, then possibly if our environment is what everything in it, including those same natural resources and the water we're thinking of. So if the environment was to, it's not well protected, then definitely mining itself might not exist, and then society, which is us, we might also not exist. So basically, sustainability or environmental sustainability is simply put, is conducting our daily activities, or what in the context of mining, conducting mining activities in ways that does not damage the environment, and in ways that society or members of society or people of this country continue to rely on natural resources like water for their own survival. So, and when I look at sustainability, there are various principles that can inform this idea on what this entails. And the first one is equity. By equity, I simply understand that whatever we do to the environment, or whatever we do on the environment or around water, it must be, whoever is conducting the mining operation must ensure that water remains available. Of course, water in good quality remains available to everyone, including the present generation, which is us, and the generation unborn, which and this ties with the idea of sustainable development, which I'm sure many people must have heard about. It's in the South African Constitution. I mean, in Section 24 of the Constitution, it's right in there. In many legislation, right in South Africa, it's there in the preamble very often, saying talking about sustainable development and so on. So that is the idea of, I don't want to go into detail, start defining what sustainable development is, but it's born out of the idea of sustainability. So this is very linked. If you go look at the definition of sustainable development itself, it will bring you back to what I just explained around these three pillars of sustainability. So we have to make sure that we don't affect water in a way that us living today, we can't have access to water, and the people coming after, or we have water and damage it, and people who come after us don't have water. That's equity. And then there's integrity. Integrity is mainly, if you want to achieve sustainability, then one has to constantly make sure that something like water is maintained intact, in good condition, to make sure that it's always available. And then precaution, directly linked to the principle of, to the precautionary principle is, and possibly, and like also the polluter pays principle, simply means whatever you do, say we're talking in the context of mining, however you conduct your mining activities, and you just have to make sure that necessary precautions are taken such that resources like water are not negatively affected, or as less affected as possible, as reasonable possible. So that's the idea. And when I mentioned the polluter pays principles, I mean, if you pollute water, for example, you will have to take the precaution to make sure that you remediate it, or you do whatever you can do to make sure that the water is returned to a state where it can at least be used for another purpose, even if it's not for drinking, at least farming and maybe recreational purposes. And then the principle of improvement in the context of sustainability simply means it comes back to the idea of remediation, which I just mentioned earlier, or rehabilitation, if you want to put it that way. And recycling. So if, like I said earlier, mining by nature is always going to affect the environment, whether we like it or not. But when that does happen, one has to take necessary measures to to make sure that you improve the quality of water. And this will go through either your remediation or recycling. When you recycle, you're trying to clean the water or to do what you can do to fix the problem. And by so doing, you're improving the quality of affected water resources. And then integration and involvement. Integration, first of all, means when it comes to protecting water resources, you have to consider every idea, every possible idea. And I will say later why this matters. Maybe if I can quickly mention that in the context of South Africa, protection of water in the mining sector, is an affair of different government departments, which I will mention later. And when water is likely to be affected, those different government departments should have a say, and this has to do with what consultation or cooperation and so on. So those different ideas and have to be taken into account, or different positions have to be taken into account to make sure that the same goal is being pursued. And involvement also involving different thoughts and different stakeholders, in this case, including even affected communities or mining communities, as we may want to call them. Because like something I found out is that they are the most affected. So their opinion really matters when water is likely to be affected. They need to, or just let's just say interested and affected parties. So everyone who has an interest in that particular water source that is likely to be affected has to be consulted, because he has interest in that or is likely to be affected. So they have to be consulted. And then moving to good governance. I'll first say governance just on its own is mainly about decision making. The definition is obviously broader than what I just said, but just know whatever you say about decision making, whether you're talking about whether the decision was rational or irrational, whatever you're thinking about, that it's boiled down to making a decision. And like I said, I focus on government or the state at this stage because of its duty to its people. And so then good governance on the other side it refers to the processes of how governance itself is pursued. What I mean by this is that good governance is just the quality of governance. It's what, when you pursue good governance, you're trying to make governance of good quality, that can achieve good results. Because in terms of governance, you make a decision whether it's good or bad, you're making a decision. But if it has to be good and achieve positive result, have a positive impact on the people who are concerned by this decision, say other stakeholders, including communities, then the quality becomes important. How do you ensure that this quality is achieved? These different points I have on this picture that I also borrow from Shutterstock. Let's start with accountable or accountability, which simply, there is no way one can achieve, or the government can achieve good governance, or can be seen as practicing good governance if the government is not accountable. Accountable just means taking responsibility for what you do. So if the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy issues a water use license, they are responsible of that decision. And if it goes bad, they have to fix it. It's their responsibility. Like I mentioned, because of time, we can't go into too much details, but I will be available to answer a question even either today or even beyond this forum. I will be delighted to answer any question. So because of time constraint, I won't go into too detail, but I'm just briefly saying things. Then moving to transparency, or you're saying transparent on this thing. For a decision maker to practice good governance, of course, and to be accountable, there need to be transparency. because it's there's only when it's transparent, when you are transparent, or when the decision maker is transparent, that allow other stakeholders to see what you are doing. And that helps keep the decision maker even more accountable, and of course pursue good governance. Because if you are transparent, then knowing that people will judge what you are doing, there's more effort, there's more willingness from your side to do something that is clean, something that is good, that you can account for, you can take responsibility for. Of course, it's not always the case, but I understand when you talk of transparency, you're talking of access to information and so on, um, with access to information, which simply means the more you're transparent, the more you're likely to allow people to have information. It could just be on how you arrive at a particular decision. And that also contributes in rendering a decision maker accountable. And then very far down, I'm not going to look at all these concepts around this circle, around this good governance circle, but they are very directly related. You look down, far down, there's participatory, which comes from participation or public participation. It's also directly linked with access to information, or even inclusiveness, which is just next to it. It's very important that different stakeholders or interested and affected parties, communities affected by mining, it is, and by the way, it's a right in South Africa, right from the Constitution down to the National Environmental Management Act. It is their right to be part and parcel of the decision making. They have to be consulted. And that's where participation comes from. They have to participate in this decision, voice their opinion, their satisfaction or their dissatisfaction, and they must be attended to, and they must be included in the decision making of. And like I said, as I also mentioned earlier, many departments, more than one department, are involved in water protection in the mining context, and they have to be included in the decision making, either through consultation or however their opinion is important. And so based on this, after looking at good governance and good governance, and added to sustainability, to me, it became clear that this can help, this can play a role in achieving sustainability, water sustainability in particular. And so from here on, the question was, what then? Why then is it not working? Or how is the law? Because the law, we know in society in general, somehow we always need those rules and regulations to guide us. And this is where the law comes in, to make sure that these different concepts or features of good governance and sustainability actually work. So that took me to the legal framework, which the Constitution, of course, there are several other, in the Constitution, there are many other sections that will tell you about governance and cooperative governance, accountability, participation, and access to information. Well, we're not going to go into all those details, but at least they are there to guide. So all those principles I mentioned in what, be it in governance or, yeah, in governance, first of all, the Constitution is there, but Section 24, which deals specifically with environmental protection, to me, it creates a mandate for whoever is responsible of water protection in the mining sector to build from that. And that's from where you have your MPRDA, which of course, since the 2014 amendment, or which since the 2014, when the president signed the amendment into law, since 2014, the MPRDA no longer regulate environmental protection, but nonetheless, it mentions it in the sections I have in here, like section 37 and the other one. It would tell you that this is regulated as per the National Environmental Management Act, and points you to where to go. And so you move to, and these different laws also have their different regulations, which also tell you the same thing, which also give you more details into what the main act are saying. So your NEMA, especially section 2, will tell you clearly what an environmental protection should look like. And then there are other sections which will tell you how environmental authorization, for example, environmental authorization has to do with for you to conduct a mining activity, you have to, I mean, when you carrying out a mining activity, which is which is a listed activity, you need an environmental authorization, and it's issued by the Department of Mineral Resources. I would say a little bit, maybe in the next slide or so. I think the next slide I will be able to tell you how it happens that the Department of Mineral, or the Minister of Mineral Resources responsible for mineral resources, is the one issuing environmental authorization, and not the Department of Environmental Affairs and Forestry. And then you have your National Water Act, which of course it doesn't say even though it mentioned that water has to be protected by any means, it doesn't go specific like in NEMA. I mean, National Environmental Management Act will tell you directly, specifically what is done, that this aspect of mining is dealt with by the Minister of Mineral Resources. But this most mainly, as far as mining is concerned, where it's taught specifically is water use license. You have, if you are going to carry out a mining activity and you're going to use water, then you need that license to be able to use it. Here you will get it. And of course, nonetheless, even in section 2, it will tell you how water has to be protected. And then you move to your promotion of access to justice act, which also will tell you how an administrative action, which are, of course, actions of government or people in power and so on, or in the administration of the country, how their actions or their decisions must be made, and which has to be fair to everyone, or on everyone that should be affected with this decision. That decision has to be fair to them. And then you also have your promotion of access to information act, which will tell you, or which provide guidelines on how affected or concerned citizens of South Africa can request information or can access information on issues that concern them or that affect them. And so all these pieces of legislation and their regulations play a key role, and they provide, according to, in my view, a good base to inform or to guide the pursuit of water sustainability through good governance, because they also provide how, it makes provision on how good decision making can happen, or can be pursued, can progress. But I also found that the legal framework, as is, despite me finding it very interesting and at times very inclusive, there are also some concerns where, for example, the environmental impact assessment processes, a little bit, I would say I find it a little bit flawed in the sense that, yes, the law says if you want to carry out a mining activity, you must prepare and submit an environmental impact assessment, and the company has to hire an independent environmental impact assessment practitioner to do this. That's good and fine. The only concern remains that it's difficult for the Department of Mineral Resources to know whether the impact assessment itself was conducted genuinely or fairly. There's just no proof or no concrete. It's not clear whether it's done properly. And so I find that concerning. And of course, looking into literature also, it's not a concern that I carry alone. And so that's one thing, that one of the limits that I found within the legal framework, that environmental impact assessment is an essential part of an environmental authorization process. But however, one cannot guarantee how genuine it is, and for various reasons, which I outlined some in my thesis. And then there's also the issue with public participation, whereby, yes, the law says you have to consult, except that it doesn't provide enough guidelines on how this must be done to ensure that, for example, communities where there are very often even people who are not educated enough to understand the process. And as a result, sometimes public participation process becomes just box ticking, where sometimes, many a times, the communities are mostly met to see what they stand to gain from the mining project, and not what they stand to lose. And that the list goes on, and it's things like we don't have enough time to go into all those details, but it's things I can always talk about at another time. And then the time frames, particularly public consultation or participation processes. The time frame is 30 days. Well, it says at least 30 days. Now, the issue that I find particularly is, what if 30 days is not enough? And the environmental assessment practitioner simply say, yeah, I've carried on 30 days. And I tell you this with that there are cases where those timeframes are really not enough. They're really not, and I picked up in my thesis that that could also be a reason why some public participation processes are not as inclusive as they should be, and could also be sometimes a reason why an environmental impact assessment might not be as inclusive as it should be, because of time that the person had to. But then even the law says it's just minimum, means you can go above that. Do they always go above to make sure that they cover everything? That's question mark. And then section 24G of NEMA. Here's a section that's allowed, which says, not allowed, which says if someone happens to start a mining project without environmental authorization, or without the requisite permit or authorization to start the project, particularly environmental authorization, which is the concern of this thesis, is that that person can be held to pay a fine and repair the damage. And well, I have issues with the way it was formulated to say maybe. It keeps using the term maybe, which means it may also not be. And by the way, like Professor Glazowski puts it nicely, it looks like a section that simply help people who have infringed the law to correct their mistakes. And so one may as well just go ahead with his project, and when he's caught or when the right time comes, he will pay a fine. And that fine, what portion of that fine is actually what the person gained by starting his or her project without the requisite authorization. But yeah, those are the type of things that I found a little bit concerning. Then I'm checking the time. And then the one environmental system, which brings me back to the point which I mentioned earlier about the Department of Mineral Resources being the one to issue environmental authorization. Well, this came out with the one environmental system in with the 2014 amendment, or the amendment coming into force, whereby they came to this agreement that every environmental provision that was in the MPRDA must be moved to the National Environmental Management Act. But the Department of Mineral Resources is responsible to issue environmental authorizations and also to enforce its provision in the mining sector. So the only thing the Department of Minerals Environmental Affairs does is they can hear appeals. So if your environmental authorization is issued or not issued and you have concern, you want to appeal anything, then you can go to the Department of Environmental Affairs and Forestry. And so, but of course, the Department of Mineral Affairs, Mineral Resources has to do this in consultation with the Department of Environmental Affairs and even Water and Sanitation where necessary, when it comes, depending what the issue is. And so it has to be. And the concern I have with this is, with the one environmental system, is that the Department of Mineral Resources has has a main mandate to promote economic development. So by having to issue environmental authorizations or to strictly enforce environmental protection, which naturally will impede economic development in the mining sector, this comes across as conflict of interest, because it's difficult. I wouldn't want to be in the place of that minister, because it's difficult to want to promote economic development yet be carrying other duties which will block the same economic development. And like I mentioned, there are all examples out there of cases where this doesn't seem to be working, including consultation between the departments and so on. And so the main point of the main idea of this system was to synchronize the issue of mining permits, water use licenses, and environmental authorizations to ensure a coordination of policies and programs of the different departments that are involved, which are the 3 departments I just mentioned. So whether that is working, there's a big question mark, and it's a concern for around the legal framework. Then the last thing, one last concern, is clarity around the rehabilitation funds. So the main issue that I find is not only those funds are usually not enough, but which I'm at my level, I struggle to find out how we can make sure that the funds are enough, because no one really ever know exactly what impact or how much it will cost to rehabilitate a specific mine site. But one issue was the transparency around how these funds are handled, how are they kept, when are they transferred to the Minister of Mineral Resources if he or she has to ensure rehabilitation of the area where mining happened or took place, and if it has to be transferred, which account is it put on? Maybe there are some government policy papers which says that, but the legislation doesn't say that, and not even the regulations. And then some mining companies, I guess, in an attempt to carry out what I call progressive rehabilitation, whereby as they move forward with their project, they rehabilitate. Some want to have access to these funds so that they can do it simultaneously. And of course, the law doesn't allow them to have access to the funds. And it's an issue that I'm not sure how it has to be dealt with, but it has to. I make some suggestion in my conclusion, but it's things that it doesn't come around up clear, because it's not clear how these funds are handled. And even when some mining companies say we want to fix this thing as we go ahead, they can't access the fund, and there are many instances of where we have close to about 6,000 on rehabilitated mines in South Africa, and the problem is always funds. Of course, most of those mining mines were abandoned very long time ago, but even to today, we still have mining companies ending up very bankrupt, and there's no other money anywhere. And so when even the funds they set aside are not sufficient, there's not much that one can do. So that's something I think should be addressed around the legal framework. But despite this, I strongly argue that even with these flaws or limits, if I can put it that way, what is that part which is clear in the legal framework can still achieve something far better than what is actually witnessed across South Africa. That is not the case. And that takes me to my analytical chapter, or where I analyze how the laws are implemented. Say the part that is good, despite the fact that there are some limits in the legal framework um, which may impede proper implementation or proper protection of water resources. The first thing I looked at is cooperative governance. Why cooperative governance? There are three or more, or let's say three main departments that protecting water resources in the mining sector is their responsibility. Are they cooperating enough? That already comes out negative. The cooperation, consultation, working together is not working, or doesn't work as it should. Not, not that it's not working at all. They do, but the examples that I am able to gather clearly indicate that it's not enough, and these issues even come out in court. In court, I've just mentioned some few court cases here, but there are other cases that are in reports and so on. Even the South African Human Rights Commission, they have also a report from them and different NGOs which are concerned, which champion environmental protection in South Africa. So after cooperative governance, then there's accountability. I find that the absence of cooperative governance also doesn't help accountability. Besides the fact that accountability on its own, whether with cooperative governance or not, already is not really working, because like this case I highlighted under accountability, it involved the Department of Mineral Resources and Environmental Affairs, and I believe Water and Sanitation also. They were all involved, but yet it's still, there were issues with how an environmental authorization or a mining authorization, a mining permit was granted in an area, in a sensitive area, in an area sensitive, which was a source of fresh water. So accountability is at one other issue I found, and that's it highly impede how, if a decision maker is not accountable, then how can the rule of law be implemented, on how can the law be implemented in a way that it truly achieves what it has to. Then transparency and access to information, it's another issue, whereby from various issues that I came across, even the Department of Mineral Resources is not even transparent enough with other departments with which it's supposed to collaborate. Transparency already not enough among them. Then a lot of communities complain about not being able to access information that could have helped them to make informed decision on whether they accept a mining project or not. And then public participation, another big issue, which shows, from what I find, it shows that very often public participation processes are merely box ticking, and merely situations where community members who even though they don't get enough support from the government, which could have helped them to make informed decisions, and sometimes on their own or assisted by NGOs, enlightened by NGOs. Some people feel intimidated and so on when they try to oppose or to voice their opinion. And so that's another issue I found. It's broad. This is the whole chapter in my thesis. And when I talk of public, it covers pages, but I'm just saying the main things globally for the sake of time. So with all these things in mind and others that I can't mention here, but this is just the tip of an iceberg, which I can mention now. it became clear. The conclusion I arrived at is that sustainability as is good. One can rely on. It's something that can really help to achieve, to protect water resources in the South African mining sector. This can further be promoted if we rely on good governance that is guided by legislation, and that legislation is there even with its flaws. It's right there. So the main issue is implementation. Even though there's some flaws in this law, the main issue is implementation and enforcement. Of course, the other thing I arrive at is compliance also. Even when government does make effort, one challenge that they come across is compliance. But because I was mainly focusing on what the government should be doing right before we start looking at what the people who are supposed to comply should be doing also right. So those are the type of things I arrived and I basically concluded that the legal framework beside. Okay, one thing that came out from as reasons why good governance is not effective enough or accountability is an issue. It also came out clearly that the Department of Mineral Resources lacked human capacity or even people with the right qualities or skills to promote or to defend or to protect water resources. That's one thing. So it's one of the recommendations. There needs to be proper training of people who are supposed to deal with this thing. And then the legislation has to somehow be improved, especially regarding financial issues and public participation, because it's very obvious that good participation and access to information can really allow affected parties to see what is going on, voice their opinion, and it could help to hold those who make irrational decisions accountable. But yeah, this is basically what I can say in summary, but the issue is deeper than what I just mentioned here. And Aysha, I'm sure I'm far above the time I was supposed to use for this, but I'm done now, and I would rather answer questions on things that people want deeper, want me to go deeper. And like I said, we only have a few minutes left. I'm more than ready to answer questions through emails and stuff.
Thanks so much, Bernard. It was a brilliant presentation, and I'm really, it's just thoroughly enjoyable to kind of speak to the more philosophical, broader concepts that you can translate into every single context, and you've done it so well now within the water context and mining context in South Africa. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the questions. We will finish quite promptly, probably about 2 minutes before 3 today for the purposes of the platform. So yes, let's get going. So Biolongo says he's enjoyed your presentation and he has one question. Why is sustainability illustrated as the roof rather than being the foundation? You seem to have explained that everything depends on it.
That's a good one. Well, how I understood is to say, if we want, my point was that if we want to lift sustainability up as this thing that we must hold on to lead us into where we can continuously have access to clean water or to safe water resources. It has to be underpinned. So the fact that I have those pillars at the bottom doesn't necessarily mean that there must be that sustainability shouldn't be the foundation. But I'm just trying to say sustainability could be the foundation, but it needs those pillars at the bottom, without which the foundation will be unsteady. I'm not sure if I'm making the point, but that's how I understood this. That whether we make it foundation or the roof or however, there must be those pillars without which, whether it's even if it's we call it foundation, it will be shaky if it's not well grounded. Those were my thoughts in that concern. I don't necessarily mean that it's, yeah. Yeah.
I suppose it's it can be pictured as sort of steel reinforcement in the foundation.
Yeah.
Presentation. You mentioned that you have concerns regarding the adequacy of rehabilitation funds. Some mining companies do report in their annual integrated reports, EGS, that they are adequately funded. What is your comment on the reliability of such declarations, considering that these reports are board approved and are publicly available in the light of the observations you have made?
I must say that as far as mining companies are concerned, I haven't done detailed research on them. Remember, my thesis was only recently approved, and obviously the role that mining companies play is one of the things I want to look at beyond my thesis. So those are things I'm still looking at to see how much money do they even provide? Where does the money end up? Because the story I've had so far is from the government side. So I take them on their story and I want to address that. So I haven't read reports of mining companies about what they do, but of course I've read things about how they say we provide this, but the honest thing is very often when the mining process actually closes down, those funds are usually not enough. But from the start, they usually feel that it's enough. But it's really difficult for me to answer this question clearly because I'm in that space now where I'm trying to get into what the mining companies themselves are doing. How much money how do they, something I'm trying to look at is how do they even calculate how much money they put aside, because there's no point if you're putting aside 5 million rands when actually we need 10 million maybe per square meter covered, then something is wrong. So those are things I'm trying to understand now myself as far as mining companies go.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Kengni, for joining us today. Well done, and I think for the purposes of SAIMM, I'm going to close the session now. Thank you so much for the participants as well, and I will see you all next week.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again, participants.
Always.